Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capitol Dateline Online. I'm your host, Brad Swanson, and we're coming to you just a few blocks from the Capitol at the headquarters of the Florida Cable Telecommunications Association. I am once again joined by our friend and editor, Jim Saunders, who is the executive editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, welcome.
Thanks.
All right, so we are in a down week. We're in between committee weeks and the beginning of session, and things were pretty hot last week. So let's start with the big issue that's getting all the ink right now, which is Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida, and potentially their funding not coming through.
Well, the governor and Speaker Corcoran are still banging heads on these issues, and the House has changed their position a little bit over the past week or so. They have broken off Visit Florida from this debate. The issue is whether the state should fund Enterprise Florida, the incentives that Enterprise Florida gives to businesses to try to get them to come to Florida, and also whether the state should fund Visit Florida, the tourism marketing agency. And the governor's been pretty strong on this, so he wants the money, and Speaker Corcoran does not want to fund them. But they had the House had put together a big bill that included abolishing those two agencies, along with some other economic development programs. But the House is kind of showing some signs of moving on the Visit Florida issue. They have now proposed a separate bill dealing with Visit Florida, which set all kinds of guidelines for how Visit Florida could operate, and leave the funding question to the budget negotiations. And meanwhile, there's still another bill that would abolish Enterprise Florida. So there is some movement on that issue. Now, whether they can get to a place where the governor can be comfortable with them and compromise, I'm not sure. The Senate seems to be kind of laying back in the weeds at this point, just kind of watching the other two go at it, and kind of just waiting to see how it plays out a little bit.
Well, so did any of that change in position, do you think, come from the governor's actions in members' districts, or was it the House just changing their position? Was it inside the Beltway conversations or influence, or was it those actions out on the streets?
Well, the governor's been very aggressive about going out into members' districts and calling them out for their support of abolishing these agencies. I've always thought, and we've talked about it before, is that Visit Florida is a little bit of a different animal than Enterprise Florida. I mean, Visit Florida is tourism, and Florida's economy is very heavily dependent on tourism. And I think people have more identification with Visit Florida than they do with Enterprise Florida, which is a little bit, it's an economic development agency, but I think it's a little bit more nebulous to people than Visit Florida is. So the governor has gone out into some of these coastal districts and called out House members for their support of abolishing these agencies, and I tend to think that's played a role in the House moving a little bit. Again, the funding issue is not resolved, and I mean, none of this is resolved, but the funding issue is really going to be, I think, where a lot of this comes down to. The House may pass a bill to abolish Enterprise Florida. I don't see the Senate probably going along with that, and I know the governor would veto it. Right. So the real issue is, I think, going to come down to funding. The governor wants $85 million for Enterprise Florida. He wants $76 million for Visit Florida. And I think once we get into budget negotiations, those are going to be pretty big issues.
Right, so Visit Florida is going from sharing a little sunshine to possibly working a little bit more in the sunshine, right? And then...
Well, I mean, a big part of this is, or part of what the House is going for is trying to get more transparency in the way these agencies have operated. I mean, Visit Florida got some really bad PR recently when, there's issues about contract with Pitbull, the rapper, and so on. So, I mean, in the whole scheme of things, that's a relatively small amount of money in their whole operation, but that was definitely a public relations hit and a political hit.
All right, well, we'll see how both of those programs shake out. I'm sure they'll both steal plenty of oxygen.
Yeah, I mean, this could be going on for a while.
Right.
So.
All right, well, let's step out of the Capitol. Let's go to Jacksonville. Former Mayor Delaney and president of Jacksonville
University of North Florida.
University of North Florida, thank you. And he has since said he's going to retire and has been rumored for some potential activity over here.
Yeah, Mayor Delaney, he's former Jacksonville Mayor Delaney, President Delaney. He announced that he will retire in 2018 when his contract expires. maybe retire isn't the proper word. He's going to step down as president of the University of North Florida. He's been there for, I believe it's 14 years at this point, after serving 2 terms as the Jacksonville mayor. Delaney's only 60 years old, and he was a real up-and-comer in not only Jacksonville politics, but in state politics. And then he became UNF president, and he's been there. But even as UNF president, he was mentioned when Charlie Crist appointed a U.S. senator back when Charlie Crist was governor. Delaney was in that mix. I don't think the political fire's ever quite gone out with him. And he told one of our reporters yesterday that he's leaving the political options open. He, never say never is exactly what he said. So there's a potential he could try to run for office again, whether on the local level or the statewide level. He did say he's not interested in running for governor. But there's 3 cabinet positions open next year, including Attorney General. Before he was mayor, Delaney's background was as a chief deputy state attorney in Jacksonville, in Duval County. So he does have that background if something like Attorney General appealed to him. So he has a very strong base in Jacksonville. There are a lot of influential Republicans in Jacksonville and money people in Jacksonville. So I think he's going to be somebody to watch over the next year in terms of if he does decide to get back in the game. If he doesn't, he's an attorney, he's 60 years old, he's totally connected in Jacksonville. I'm sure he'll do fine.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he will too, but we'll stay tuned on that. I know a lot of fans on both sides of the aisle of his leadership and rejuvenating, if you will, Jacksonville. So should be interesting. All right, so let's move back into the legislative session. The death penalty issue is up, and what are you predicting potentially for the first week? Tell us a little bit about where that stands.
Well, the death penalty, I think, is going to be one of the first major issues the legislature takes up and disposes of. There's been a series of U.S. Supreme Court and Florida Supreme Court rulings since January of last year that have essentially put the death penalty in Florida on hold. And one of those issues involves whether juries need to be unanimous in recommending that people be sentenced to death. This is in the sentencing phase of cases, not in the guilt phases. And Florida has, in the past, has had just a majority. A majority of the jury could recommend to the judge that a person be put to death. That's always been controversial. The legislature changed that last year to say 10 out of 12 jurors need to make those recommendations. But the Florida Supreme Court tossed that out. It said you have to have unanimous jury recommendations for people to be put to death. So it's a relatively straightforward issue. Death penalty litigation is not straightforward, but this issue itself is relatively straightforward. The legislature, both the House and the Senate, are moving fast on bills to make that change. They realize from a legal perspective they don't have much choice, and they want to get the death penalty process back moving. So I expect that to pass maybe first week, second week, very, very quickly. The House and Senate seem to agree on it. And again, I think they all want to get the death penalty process back up and running, which has been on hold since January of 2016.
Yeah, and that's a tough one because there's so many court processes that get held up when the law is unclear and cases just sit. So
well, and there's all kinds of ramifications from these U.S. Supreme Court and Florida Supreme Court rulings last year. There's a lot of questions out there about how it affects old cases, those sorts of things. But this issue about unanimous jury verdict recommendations can be taken care of pretty simply, I think.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to seeing what happens on that. It's a tough topic to talk about, but it's one that legislators are called upon to address. So we'll stay tuned. Yeah. All right. So let's move then over to the Senate and let's look at one of the president's priorities, which was water. What's happening there? What do we think is going to happen there?
Well, Joe Negron, the Senate president, has made a top priority of a proposal to. It's a $2.4 billion proposal. It's a big number on this. And it would buy about 60,000 acres of land south of Lake Okeechobee. The issue is that Lake Okeechobee, they have to discharge water. The Army Corps of Engineers has to discharge water from the lake every once in a while when lake levels rise. And they've been discharging it into the Caloosahatchee River on the west and St. Lucie Estuary on the east, and that water is polluted. And it's apparently been pretty pretty messy down there. A lot of polluted water going into waterways that people live on. That it's part of their lives, and so Negron's idea, which is supported by groups like the Everglades Foundation, is to buy a bunch of land south of the lake, move water into a reservoir on that land, and which would prevent this pollution from going each way. But this has become a very controversial, heavily lobbied issue. The sugar industry, for one, opposes it, and they own most of that land south of the lake. Also, the House seems cool to the idea. Matt Caldwell, who's representative from down in Lee County, is very influential in the House on land and water conservation types of issues. Last week, he was expressing some serious reservations about Negron's plan. One of the issues simply is that Negron wants to use bonding to borrow money for the project. The House is opposed to bonding money. But I think there's some other issues about, with taking this farmland out, or sugar land out of production, putting this reservoir there has caused a lot of controversy. There's also people in North Florida who are arguing that this would divert too much conservation money to South Florida, and what about the rivers and springs in North Florida? So there's a lot of factors out there. Negron, but this is home cooking for Negron. I mean, this is his district where all this polluted water has been going. So it isn't just an abstract issue to him. It's something that he hears about from his constituents all the time. He's from Stewart, which is right there. So he's going to keep pushing it, and I expect the Senate to pass it out probably, I would assume they're going to pass it out relatively early in the session. Don't know that for a fact. But the question is whether the House can come on board or whether they can reach some sort of compromise.
Right. So we're expecting President Negron to fight the good fight, and then unfortunately it looks like there's just not a lot of support on the other side for it.
I mean, it's a little early to tell. I mean, this is a very complicated issue.
Yeah.
Very complicated issue. So, there's potential for compromise, but he has made clear that he wants something to happen down there.
Well, the issue that is warm in the House and has been moving, it looks like, is the gambling bill, and so it looks like the tribe has a compact that's moving. So, are the pari-mutuels in or out of that? Where does that all stand?
As usual with gambling, everybody's all over the place. But the House and Senate are taking very different approaches to gambling bills. The House is focused heavily on reaching a gambling compact with the Seminole tribe that would provide money to the state. The House is pitching the idea of using this money to go into the education system, help fund the education system. The Senate, on the other hand, is taking a far broader approach to gambling. They are talking about expanding gambling at pari-mutuels. For instance, 8 counties have passed referendums to allow slot machines at pari-mutuel facilities. And currently, they are not allowed to offer slot machines. The Senate would authorize that. So that's just one example of what's in the Senate bill. So at this point, the two chambers are very far apart. I think one thing that may be a common ground is that they're going to want some money from the Seminoles if they can get it.
Right.
So, but reaching that agreement with the Seminole tribe and getting enough legislators to come on board is not an easy thing. Yeah. I mean, gambling bills come up seemingly every year. There's a big fight about it, and nothing passes.
And traditionally, exclusivity is the piece that would would preserve the Seminole Compact and then exclude the other pari-mutuel facilities out, and then it's parity and fairness, and those arguments are always made.
Well, that's part of the difficulty too, because you got to get the Seminole tribe to sign on and be willing to provide parts of the revenues to the state.
Right. And
in exchange for that, they want exclusive rights to offer certain games. For example, they can offer blackjack at many of their casinos right now that the pari-mutuels cannot offer. Yeah. So that's what the exclusivity issue is. And so trying to get all these parties together in a heavily lobbied issue like this, when there's this much money at stake, is very difficult.
And frankly, antagonists will argue that Florida's economy, being a family-friendly global brand, is the antithesis of why the expansion of gambling or the continuance of any kind of gambling goes against our economy's growth versus with it.
Well, and that's one other element that I didn't mention in this whole debate. There's a whole lot of people that don't want any expansion of gambling. They're fine if, particularly at pari-mutuels. So the issue, comes down to how do you bring all these people together and reach a compromise?
Right.
It's pretty difficult.
Right, a lot of stakes. A lot of people have big stakes in that conversation.
Right.
Well, Jim, thank you again for this time and your insight. Last question. So what do we think is going to happen next week, first week of session? Of course, we'll have all the parliamentary procedures and the pomp and circumstance, but beyond that, what are we looking for next week?
Well, the governor will give his State of the State address on Tuesday. It'll be interesting to see what he says about these issues about Enterprise Florida and Visit Florida. Also, as we talked about earlier, I expect the death penalty to start moving pretty fast. Also, there's an issue about stand your ground, changes the stand your ground law that are poised to pass the Senate pretty fast and may move through the House early in the session.
All right, Jim. Well, we'll stay tuned to the News Service of Florida and look for your daily briefs and as to what's happening both today and next week. So thanks for coming by again.
Thank you.
Thanks. For more news, views, and opinions, go to our Facebook page at Capitol Dateline Online or connect with us on Twitter at the FCTA. Thanks for joining us.